Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're gonna watch one ordinary evening turn into something unforgettable when Alex steps out of a high-stakes orchard survey, stops to help Tuna build a simple fence, and, without realizing it, becomes the man she can no longer imagine living without. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The late morning sun filtered through the thick pomelo canopy, breaking into soft pieces of light that moved across the ground like water. Alex walked slowly between the rows, his pace unhurried but his eyes alert, scanning each branch with the kind of focus that came from years of carrying other people's harvest in his mind. Around him, white pomelo blossoms opened everywhere, dense and fragrant, their scent mixing with the damp smell of soil and leaves, still holding the last of the morning coolness. To anyone passing through, the orchard might have looked peaceful, maybe even prosperous. Trees in bloom, workers moving steadily, birds flickering through the upper branches. But Alex knew better than to trust beauty at first glance. Orchards had taught him that the most promising season could still turn without warning. He stopped beneath one heavily flowered branch and lifted it lightly with his fingertips. The blossoms were crowded together, thick enough to hide the leaves. "Branches like this carry too many flowers," he said, his voice low but clear enough for the man walking beside him to hear. "If pollination happens at the right time, the fruit set will look good at first. But if we leave too many on, the tree will wear itself out trying to feed them all." The man beside him nodded immediately. "Yes, sir. The farmers have already pollinated in the early morning and again late in the afternoon." Alex released the branch and stepped back, his gaze moving from one tree to the next. On some of the older trees, the foliage had grown too thick. Ventilation was poor. Air sat heavily beneath the leaves, trapped and warm. He already knew what that could lead to: smaller fruit, uneven skin, inconsistent sweetness, the kind of imperfections customers noticed even when farmers wished they wouldn't. "We need quality before quantity," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The sentence came out firm, but regret moved quietly beneath it. He knew what those words meant in practice. More pruning, more thinning, more labor, more fruit sacrificed early so the remaining ones could grow strong. Every decision had a human cost somewhere. He looked deeper into the orchard. A few farmers were already working under the trees, hats pulled low, hands moving through weeds, roots, irrigation lines. Last year had been cruel. Sudden weather changes, disease pressure, failed expectations. He still remembered the faces men and women trying to stand straight in the middle of a ruined season, pretending not to calculate loss before the fruit had even fully fallen. "I hope there are no disasters this year," Alex said quietly. "The people need one stable season, just one." A breeze moved through the branches then, carrying loose petals into the air. They drifted across the rows like tiny white prayers, catching sunlight before disappearing into the grass. Alex watched them go and felt, as he often did, the strange weight of responsibility settle more fully on his shoulders. Customers expected consistency. Buyers expected quality. The farmers expected guidance strong enough to protect them from another bad year. All of it came back to him eventually, one way or another. They walked on. Farther in, the orchard changed. Half the area had already moved past bloom and into early fruit set. Tiny green pomelos sat like hidden promises beneath dark leaves. On the other half, blossoms still dominated pure white, full, almost too abundant. Alex crouched near one low branch and studied a small cluster of newly set fruit. "This bunch set well," he said, "but we need the farmers to stay ahead of the trees now. Weed early, fertilize before the roots get stressed. If they wait too long, the tree weakens before the fruit even sizes properly." His companion pointed toward one section farther up. "I already told some of them to start installing automatic irrigation systems there." That caught Alex's attention. He straightened and followed the direction of the man's hand. The dry spell had lasted longer than expected this year, and he had been worrying about it for days. Lack of water at the wrong time meant blossom drop, poor fruit retention, weak flesh, and all the slow invisible damage that only revealed itself too late. "Good," Alex said. "That matters." He kept walking, thinking about roots, soil moisture, and timing. Irrigation wasn't only about convenience, it was about survival now. It was about reducing labor, yes, but also about removing one more way the orchard could fail when the weather turned unreliable. Near the younger section, he stopped again. Several recently grafted trees stood in neat rows, their leaves brighter, their shape more controlled. He ran his fingers lightly over one branch and nodded. "This variety has better market value," he said. "If the grafting holds well, they should gradually shift more of the orchard in this direction." The man beside him listened carefully, but Alex could tell he was also listening to the orchard itself, the quiet between instructions, the parts Alex wasn't saying. Pressure never stayed fully hidden around him. It was in the way he paused too long at problem areas, in the way his eyes returned again and again to last year's weakest sections, in the way every improvement sounded half like strategy and half like a plea. What the farmers saw as recommendations, Alex felt as obligation. They moved toward the older grove after that, where the trees had been standing for more than 15 years. The trunks were thicker there, the branches heavier, the leaves darker and glossier. The fruit hanging under them had a different kind of confidence, larger, more evenly shaped, carrying the sweetness that only age and patient care could produce. Alex rested one hand against a ripe pomelo and smiled for the first time that morning without having to force it. The older the tree, he said, the deeper the sweetness. People forget that sometimes. They think newer always means better. Around them, workers bent to pull weeds at the base of the trees. Sweat darkened the backs of their shirts. The weeds came back almost as quickly as they were removed, and everyone in the orchard knew it. Farming was full of labor that looked temporary even when it was necessary. Alex watched them for a long moment and felt that familiar mixture. Again, gratitude and pressure intertwined so tightly he could no longer separate one from the other. "Overall, this looks better than I expected," he said at last. "If the weather holds and we stay disciplined, the harvest can be stronger this year. Better yield, better quality. Enough to supply more customers without apologizing for the fruit." His companion nodded. "I'll keep monitoring closely, and I'll push the technical guidance harder." Alex gave a small nod, then looked up through the branches toward the sky. The light had shifted. Afternoon was already deepening toward evening. The orchard glowed warmer now, each leaf edged in gold. On the way back out, he asked another question without slowing down. "How are things at the starch factory?" The answer came as they kept walking. Shipments, timing, partner expectations. Nothing in Alex's life ever truly separated. Orchard, factory, contracts, labor, family, each one fed the next. Even here, in the quiet under the pomelo trees, the rest of his responsibilities kept pace beside him. When they reached the edge of the grove, he paused and turned for one last look. Rows of trees, workers bent in the distance, petals scattered in the grass, light falling low through the branches. There was something almost cruel about how beautiful it all looked when he knew how much could still go wrong. And yet, beauty mattered. Not because it solved anything, because it reminded him what was worth protecting. By the time he drove toward Tuna's place, dust had gathered along the hem of his shirt, and sunset had begun to stain the sky. The road was narrow and uneven, lined with scrub grass and small fences, and the farther he went, the quieter everything became. When he finally pulled up in front of the small farm, the last light of the day was spilling red across the yard. He saw her immediately. Tuna was in the middle of the yard, driving stakes into the ground one by one. A coil of rope lay beside her feet, and several rough wooden posts leaned against the fence waiting their turn. Sweat darkened the back of her shirt. Her movements were steady, but he could see the effort in them. He stepped out of the car and frowned without meaning to. "Tuna," he called. "What are you doing?" She looked up, cheeks flushed from work and heat, and smiled even before she answered. "I'm building a fence," she said. "The chickens keep getting into the yard." Alex glanced from the half-finished line of stakes to the rope, then back to her. In that 1 second, the whole day shifted. The orchard, the workers, the forecasts, the endless calculations, all of it receded just enough for something simpler to step forward. He pulled off his jacket. "Then let me help," he said. "It'll go faster." Tuna hesitated for only a second. Maybe it was habit that made her want to say no first. Habit, pride, the instinct of someone who has spent too long carrying practical burdens alone. But there was no performance in Alex's face, no politeness he would later forget, just simple intent. So she nodded. All right. That one word changed the whole feeling of the yard. Alex walked over, took the mallet from near the rope coil, tested the weight in his hand once, then looked down the line she had already started. The fence wasn't elaborate, just enough to keep the chickens from scratching through the newly planted section, but it still required labor. Digging, measuring, driving stakes straight, knotting the rope tightly enough that it would hold through weather and restless animals. He planted the first post without another word. The sound of the mallet striking wood echoed across the yard in steady blows, deep and clear, like a heartbeat made external. Tuna stood opposite him, passing him the next stake, then the next length of rope. Their shadows stretched long over the red dirt as the sun lowered behind them. For a while, they worked in easy silence. It was not awkward. It was a kind of silence that sometimes arises when two people stop standing on opposite sides of formality and begin moving inside the same task. Alex swung the mallet with more force than elegance, but each post went in straighter than the last. Tuna bent to tie the rope, fingers moving quickly despite her tiredness. Every now and then she glanced at him, and every time she did, the same small warmth rose in her chest again. The CEO, who spent his days talking about orchards, suppliers, and quality control, was now standing in her yard with dust on his sleeves, hammering fence posts into place because her chickens had become a nuisance. Something about that felt almost too simple to trust. "Do you have enough stakes?" he asked after a while, pausing to wipe the sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "If not, I'll stay and help more." Tuna tied a knot, pulled it tight, then looked up at him. "It's enough now," she said softly. "With your help, it's already much faster." Alex smiled at that, not because she had praised him, because he could hear the truth in her voice, and it made him strangely happy to be useful here in a way that had nothing to do with status or money. They kept working. As they did, the conversation came in pieces, small, ordinary fragments dropped between hammer strikes and knots. Tuna asked about his day. He told her a little about the pomelo orchard, about flower density, fruit set, irrigation systems, and farmers who needed a stable season more than they needed promises. She listened in the practical, attentive way she always did, not impressed for the sake of it. Interested because work, to her, was always human first. He asked about Mrs. Tang's leg, about Henry, about whether the persimmons had ripened yet on the far side of the yard. "Next time you go to market," Alex said, taking another steak from her, "let me drive you." Tuna blinked, startled. "Drive me?" He nodded. "I'd like that." She gave a small, incredulous smile. "Why?" Alex drove the post down with two more firm strikes before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I'd enjoy it, going to market with you, seeing everything. It sounds good." Something inside her shifted at the simplicity of that. He wasn't romanticizing hardship. He wasn't pretending market work was charming in some careless way. He just genuinely wanted to be beside her in the ordinary shape of her life. That mattered more than she wanted it to. By the time the last of the evening light had turned amber, the line of stakes was complete. Rope ran cleanly between them, tied tight and straight. The little gate section still needed fastening, but the boundary was there now, visible, sturdy, real. Alex leaned back to look at it and gave a quiet nod of satisfaction. Tuna stood beside him, breathing slightly harder than before, and followed his gaze. "It's beautiful," she said. He laughed softly. "It's a chicken fence. It's still beautiful." Before he could answer, the faint buzz of a motorbike reached them from the road. Tuna turned first. Her face changed instantly. "That's Henry." She crossed the yard quickly, and by the time Mrs. Tang had barely stopped the motorbike, Henry was already reaching toward his mother. Tuna lifted him into her arms, and the boy buried himself against her shoulder for half a second before wriggling to see who else was there. The second he spotted Alex, his whole face brightened. "Uncle Alex!" Alex bent down automatically and took the child from Tuna with practiced ease, as if he had done it 100 times. Henry patted his shoulder, then reached for the cup of water on the porch table. "Thirsty?" Alex asked. "Here." He held the cup while Henry drank in eager little gulps, water spilling slightly at the corners of his mouth. Tuna watched the scene in stillness so complete it almost felt like standing outside herself. The fence, the evening light, Henry in Alex's arms, the easy tenderness of it all. It looked, for one impossible second, like a life she had once stopped herself from imagining. "As long as I see you and Henry happy," Alex said quietly, not even looking at her when he spoke. "I'm happy." The words hit harder because he said them without ceremony. No careful build-up, no demand for response. Just a simple truth dropped into the middle of an ordinary evening. Tuna smiled, but her heart was no longer moving in ordinary ways. Warm lamplight had begun to spill from the doorway behind them, lighting the yard in soft gold. The newly finished gate stood between the garden and the rough path beyond, modest and handmade and more meaningful than wood and rope had any right to be. Protection had taken shape right in front of them. Alex shifted Henry higher on his hip and made some silly noise that drew laughter out of the boy immediately. The sound rang through the yard light, pure, impossible to fake. Tuna watched the two of them and felt gratitude move first, then something deeper, something with more gravity in it. For a brief moment, they looked like a family, not by law, not by declaration, just by warmth, by rhythm, by the way they naturally bent toward one another. And maybe that was why the phone call felt so abrupt when it came. Alex's phone rang from his pocket, slicing cleanly through the quiet. He handed Henry back to Tuna before answering, and the shift in his face happened almost instantly. "Yes," he said. Then, after listening for a few seconds, "I'm coming." He ended the call and slid the phone away. "Clients at the factory," he said. "I have to go." The words were ordinary, necessary, but Tuna still felt something sink lightly inside her. Not enough to show, just enough to know how much his presence had already begun to matter. She adjusted Henry on her hip and nodded. "Come back for dinner tonight?" Alex looked at her for a second longer than the question required. "Yes," he said, "I'll come back." He bent and ruffled Henry's hair. "Bye-bye, little one." Then he looked at Tuna. "Take care of yourself, all right?" She walked him to the new gate. Their hands brushed for only a second as he stepped past her, but the contact stayed in her skin even after he reached the car. He drove off in a cloud of soft red dust, and she stood there long after the sound of the engine had gone. The gate stood firm in front of her. The yard was quiet again. Evening had deepened. Henry shifted sleepily against her shoulder. "Alex is so kind," she whispered before she could stop herself. The words sounded too small for what she felt. More came after, silently this time, inside her where no one could hear them. "Every day I fall more in love with him." Tears came then not from sadness, but from the strange pressure of happiness mixed with fear. Happiness because he was here. Fear because her feelings were no longer mild enough to hide comfortably. They were growing into something she could not pretend was simple gratitude anymore. Henry's little hand grabbed at her collar, pulling her back from the edge of her own thoughts. She kissed the side of his head and carried him inside. Behind her, the new gate closed with a soft, ordinary sound. But to Tuna, it felt like something had shifted more deeply than wood on hinges. It felt like the end of one kind of waiting and the beginning of another. By the time she laid Henry down and lit the lamp properly, the whole house seemed warmer than before. Alex was no longer only the man who helped, no longer just someone kind or useful or dependable. He had become necessary. And under the deepening night sky, while the first stars appeared over the yard he had helped protect, Tuna stood in the doorway for one last moment and made a quiet promise to herself. No matter how difficult the road ahead became, she would not forget this warmth. She would protect it, she would let it grow,